Today we are going to have a great conversation between friends sitting here at the Gentleman's Club. I'm Pierre, and I'm here with my friend Tyrone, focusing in on the chapters Speaking of Courage and Notes in the book The Things They Carried.
Part 1. Focus on Norman Bowker's psychological problems. The chapter Speaking of Courage, the main focus is being placed on Norman Bowker. Norman is described in this chapter constantly driving around the lake. This visual imagery of Norman driving around and around the lake with a six-pack of beer shows the audience that obviously there's something on Norman's mind. The road was sort of a boundary between the affluent and the most affluent.
In order to further expand that thought, Norman often repeats that he almost won the Silver Star for valor, which helps us understand that him losing the Silver Star was a traumatic event.
Norman Bowker, being the man of few words that he is, has a hard time speaking to his family and friends about this event. In this chapter, the author keeps on repeating, his father would have said, which shows us that he had a very strong connection with his father, and it keeps the reader curious about the father and son conversation. A strong connection usually means that the characters are not scared to share their feeling and what the problem is, but Norman can still talk about it to his father. This helps to further expand our knowledge on how this event was serious and traumatic.
Norman wants to talk to his father about the Silver Star, but can't. Norman also views the Silver Star as a sense of approval from his father. This also explains why it is so hard for him to talk to his father about the Silver Star.
If you read through the chapter, you realize that losing the Silver Star also represents something else. The loss of the Silver Star also represents the loss of his friend. He let his friend die. Losing his friend was more important to him, but he copes by saying he lost the Silver Star instead.
Yes, and as you can see when Tim O'Brien writes in Speaking of Courage, circling the lake, Norman Bowker remembered how his friend Kiowa had disappeared under the waste and water. I didn't flip out, he would have said. I was cool. If things had gone right, if it hadn't been for that smell, I could have won the Silver Star. You can see the connection between the Silver Star and the loss of his friend. You can see how the whole story wasn't about losing the Silver Star, but it was symbolism for letting his friend die. In part 2, we will focus on how storytelling is an outlet for Tim O'Brien. Through notes, you can tell that Norman had a hard time coping with his experiences in war. You can see in notes when Norman says, "It's almost like I got killed over in Nam." In this sentence, we see how Norman has not moved past the war and never found a way to release himself from the effect the war had on him. We can see how he never found a way to move on or found a way to cope with what he saw in the war. Well,
Yeah, great idea, Pierre. And Tim O'Brien, unlike Norman Bowker, is able to deal with his experiences through storytelling. This is brought up in notes when O'Brien says, "Yet, when I received Norman's letter, it occurred to me that the act of writing had led me through a swirl of memories that might otherwise have ended in paralysis or worse. By storytelling, you objectify your own experiences." Through this phrase from Tim O'Brien, we can see that by him writing his experiences, it allowed him to talk about his experiences without going through the pain and suffering that others had gone through.
Notes is a great example of authors breaking the fourth wall as O'Brien talks directly to the audience. It helps the audience understand more about Norman Bowker and why O'Brien included Speaking of Courage.
This wraps up our sessions for this week. Make sure you come back and check with us next week as we talk about the dentist. Pause. Stop.